perhaps the best thing would be to say, throw some ideas, and then particularly to have a discussion to answer points or to add additional points. And in some way, what we'll be discussing this afternoon that has a lot to do with the future of the relationship between the European Union and Mercosur. Mercosur as something to be a common market, or at least Mercosur as a common space of a group of significant countries of South America, has something to do with what we were discussing till yesterday, particularly on Friday and Saturday, about the Irish diaspora, or I would prefer the global Irish network, in the sense that finally what we were trying to identify were the different approaches to the development of a systematic or a more systematic connectivity between so many Irish people that are in many parts of the world. And one of the activities that was mentioned was precisely the fact that this Irish community, or this global Irish, could also help to develop academic network between, not necessarily only with people of Irish origin in Argentina or in other countries, but in which people of the Irish network could help to develop. And one of the issues in which this connection could be very useful is precisely the relationship with Europe. As I was talking with some of the members of the government yesterday or Saturday, definitely Ireland, so the Irish in Ireland, are very best placed to try to decodify for us what means to work and to interact with Europe. You are very well in condition to do it, assuming that you are ratifying saying yes. You are very well in condition to, very well in condition to do it, because you are precisely not a big country, and you have precisely a lot of connection with our countries. When we interact, and we do it, and we'll continue to do it, obviously, with European Institute in Germany, in France, in Spain, we normally receive, United Kingdom, we receive the vision of a big country in the European Union with strong ties with our countries. In some cases, it could be better to have people that are related but are not so big, could eventually not have such a concrete agenda or interested agenda. And in some way, with respect to South America, eventually, in Argentina or in other South American countries, institutes similar to this could help in try, and that is, I can assure you, a difficult task to understand South America. One thing that one observed, being very much related with the academic community, Latin Americanistic academic community in the United States and in Europe, is sometimes you observe the difficulty to understand the dramatic changes that are developing today in South America as everywhere. Trying to understand South America as it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, could lead you not to understand nothing. Things are moving very quickly, as they are moving very quickly anywhere. So the Irish network and other networks could help you to understand things that are moving in a very quick way in different regions of the world. Saying this, I would like to say something more concrete with respect to the relationship between the European Union and Mercosur countries. And using, I recall when I was in the diplomacy, the diplomats teach me to be very precise in the word. I'm not saying Mercosur, I'm saying Mercosur countries. I'm not saying negotiation, I'm saying relations between the European Union, yes, they must say European Union. This relation between the European Union and Mercosur countries will be very active, not in the front page, perhaps in the front page for some days, as a result of the next summit in Madrid. Everything indicates that and this is the first provocative reflection I want to introduce, everything indicates that the next summit in Madrid will have extreme difficulties to provide good information, good news, to put it in the titles of the newspapers in South America, in Latin America, in Europe, or in the world. So everything indicates that one of the difficulties, more serious difficulties of the summit will be to produce some result. The idea was to conclude the negotiations with Central America. There are some difficulties that you know very well, that are called Honduras. And that again proves something that particularly our economist friends, I in some way I am an economist also, forget, is that politics has something to do with realities. And the evolution in Central America is difficult to forecast. The problem in Honduras will be very difficult to resolve. So I don't think that we could expect a concrete result of the negotiation of free trade agreements between the European Union and Central American countries. Eventually, yes, but for the time being, it's better to be relatively pessimistic. Then the second idea was to produce in Madrid what was in some way initiated in the last summit in Lima 2 years ago, that there is not necessarily an agreement between the European community and the Andean community. You know very well the Andean community has serious problems in this moment, different kind of reasons. But eventually, perhaps, you could have the conclusion of bilateral agreements with Colombia and with Peru. More difficult is with Ecuador. Bolivia no, and Venezuela is outside the Andean community. Difficult to know if already is outside or already is inside of Mercosur. Venezuela is there. And third concrete source of news for journalists, when I was working with ambassador in the ministry and we were preparing the meeting of Mercosur in Las Leñas in 2002, and we began to prepare the summit that would take place 6 months later.
Yes.
I recall that to my people, to my excellent collaborators, I told them, look, we must try to imagine something that could be in the front page of Financial Times the following day. Why Financial Times? Because they will not put nothing without substance. So we must produce substance. Well, I have the impression that it's difficult to imagine that something with substance will go out from this Madrid summit with respect to Mercosur, and I will concentrate some minutes to try to explain why I said this. That doesn't mean that the summit should not have any results, but I'm saying that perhaps it will be difficult to have results in terms of the relationship between the European Union and concrete economic integration processes in South America. Perhaps there will be a declaration related with social cohesion in South America, or Latin America. Some journalists, if he is in bad humor, will recall that never this kind of declaration is produced by the European Union with the Chinese or with other people in Asia. And in some way you have used, European Union, used this important subject so many times that perhaps it's difficult to imagine something new in terms of what to do in terms of social cohesion in the bilateral relation. Let me say something why I appear to be so pessimist. And let me finally say something about how I would suggest to move if really there is an interest to produce something. And this last part will be the result of being in government in 3 opportunities. I find that I have the ethical responsibility of doing always an effort to try to imagine what I would do if I were in the place I was today, because it's not too easy to criticize and propose nothing. The first point I think is very, very important to have in mind is that the summit next year will take place between 2 regions and within a world that has nothing to do with what was the origin of the idea at the end of the 90s. And perhaps we should recall in very, very few minutes the origin of the idea, and in some way I think I could witness the origin idea because I participate directly. And the idea was originated in the same moment in which the idea of Mercosur was originated, and for the same reason. Obviously, Mercosur was the result of the need to continue and developing what was initiated by the previous president of Argentina, Raúl Alfonsín, and his counterpart in Brazil, as a bilateral relation. And it was necessary to continue. That was clear. But why they took the decision to try to go very quickly, to try to develop something that in Europe appeared as reproduction of the European model. And I have the feeling that the most concrete factor is not the only, you know very well, nothing is explained only for one factor. But the most concrete single factor that explained why this decision was taken was the initiative of the United States of developing a free trade area of the Americas. In that moment was a very, very, very vague, a very, very incomplete idea. Perhaps Bush father didn't have any concrete idea of what he was meaning about, but he needed to send a concrete message to the Mexican people in the sense that what would be the bilateral agreement and then NAFTA was not a way for Mexico to leave aside its cultural and political relation with Latin America. And so this idea was a way to say, look, this is only part of a great movement to develop a free trade area space, because he used more the word space in the Americas. Then the concrete negotiation transformed this idea in and this was not necessarily originated in the United States. In some way it was Brazil and Argentina, was introduced this idea in the idea of a formal free trade area, Article 24 GATT, that was finally approved in the first summit in Miami in 1994. Why I mention this? Because in that moment, immediately after signing the Mercosur Treaty, the four governments rushed to Brussels to put the message, we need to do something with you. We are in the same road. We are trying to build the same thing. There was a meeting of Ministers of Foreign Affairs 1992, Guimarães, Portugal, and the Italians were very enthusiastic. There was a gentleman in Brussels, Manuel Marin, that was a commissioner, very enthusiastic in pushing the idea. And finally, what we were trying to say is that we wanted to cut the historical triangle of our relation with the international system that was in the southern cone, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, and in the north, at the same time, United States and Europe. At the same time, from the point of view of Europe, if United States is moving to have preferential agreement, particularly for capital goods and for government procurement, in Brazil and in other South American countries, we must move also. And you will observe since then that all the movements of the European Union with respect to bilateral agreement have been particularly with countries with which United States have already bilateral agreement, even now, Peru, Colombia, and the Central American countries. So this is important to have in mind in the origin of this idea of a bilateral negotiation. You know very well the history. Finally, it was taken the decision to have the negotiation. The negotiation was launched at the end of 1999, 1999. And in 2004, October, the negotiations arrived to a dead point. For anyone outside the negotiation failed, and most of the negotiators were very angry with people that had written negotiation failed, because it was impossible to present to the public this as a failure. It was only a moment of reflection to wait for the conditions to relaunch the negotiation. The main problem is that since that moment till now, we have 5 years have gone, and we are yet waiting the possibility that in November we have a meeting to launch the negotiation. So it's necessary to try to see what happened in that moment and what explained that since then it has been impossible to make concrete movements in terms of the negotiation. I have the feeling that there are at least 4 main reasons. There must be, as always, at least 20 more, but I identified 4, and with this I understand. I understand this was one reason, but I will present 4. The first one is, again, easy to understand, what I mentioned before. The world today and the regions, Europe and Mercosur, South America, have nothing to do even with what was the world and the region in 2004. Things have been moving and will continue to move very, very quickly in the next period. But particularly, second reason, the fact that Doha, already in that moment, was difficult to have an optimistic view about Doha, began to play an important role because, for obvious reasons, having in mind that the main difficulties, the main knocks are in the agricultural field, the argument, particularly of Europe, was, well, we must solve simultaneously or wait first to solve the knots in agriculture in Doha, and then we move in Mercosur. Some of us, in a report of Share Mercosur in Paris, make a proposal. I was chairman of the group with Patrick Messerling and other people from both sides, and we make a proposal to divide the negotiation, Mercosur-European Union negotiation, in two parts, to try to finalize a first stock, preferential stock, and to include an evolutionary clause. So once Doha was finished, it would be open the final negotiation that would be the Doha Plus negotiation. Technically it was possible, but nothing happened in that sense. There is well, you know very well, it's not necessary to say where we are in Doha. Again, we have the same double level of double image. The people that gather in Delhi, if you take face value what the Minister of Commerce of India said when the 2 weeks ago meeting finalized, we should be prepared to see the conclusion of Doha very soon. As soon as you talk with anyone involved in the negotiation, the vision is not so pessimistic, and you observe exactly the same we have been observing for many times. That is, the fault is the United States, now the fault is India, now the fault is Argentina, the industrial sector, etc. They gain blame. That is part of this kind of diplomacy. There is two other factors, and I have the impression that these are the main factors. The first one is the fact that Europe lost incentives in the negotiation once the free trade agreement of the Americas negotiation failed. If my problem was to avoid that the American firms could have a preferential status, for example, in the Brazilian government procurement market, now forget it. There will be no American preference. So why I will rush to finalize a negotiation that will complicate Doha with the same problem we have in Doha, the trade-off between agriculture and industry is difficult to obtain, forget it. But we must appear as if we were moving, because politically to say forget it is to have, nobody has said till now, forget it with respect to the free trade area of the Americas negotiation. Everyone knows that is finished, but officially is there. And the fourth factor, and the second important factor, is the European perception about Mercosur. And I want to be very frank, as I have been with other points, and I would say very clear that I don't blame the Europeans to have such a perception about Mercosur. What I observe now, talking with Europeans from different activities, I had been for 4 or 5 years executive director of the Europe-Argentina Club, the main business firms involved in the relationship, with an European chairman that was top class, the former Minister of France, he died last year, François-Xavier Ortoli. So in some way, I had been involved in many of these activities in which Europe demonstrated interest in finalizing something with Mercosur, an interest in Mercosur. But I observe now that it's more frequently, I was saying, that in my conversation with other people, with Europeans from the business sector, economic journalists, you find the same kind of question that you find since many years ago in the United States. In the case of the United States, was a question related to the fact that they never liked very much this idea of having a caucus of South American countries that you could negotiate together. They wanted to preserve the bilateral connection, and that was understandable. And the question that you listen frequently is, from now from the Europeans, as before from the Americans, is Mercosur, what are you talking about? What is Mercosur? What are you talking about? You must explain this is not something similar to the European Union for different reasons. We could discuss then which are the reasons why not only should not be something similar to the European Union. But it's more than that. It's the fact that they have doubts, in general, those Europeans, they have serious doubts that we really want to work together. And they say frequently, I have listened this being working for the Argentinian government in dialogue with European negotiators, they say, look, I hear what you are saying, I've read what you wrote, etc. But each time anyone from Mercosur comes to talk with us about any concrete problem, they talk bilaterally, and Mercosur in that moment doesn't exist. And there is one country, I will not mention this country, but it's well known which is the country, that has a kind, and I say this in that country also, no problem, that have this kind of attitude similar to the attitude of the King of France, Louis XIV, l'État c'est moi, Mercosur c'est moi. And it's more or less the same thing that if when the European Union goes to Argentina or to Brazil, and the next day comes the Germans, and they say, forget it, I am the European Union. And this is the impression that in Europe, in some way, incline people to say, well, hand off for the time being, this is not something that we could take seriously. And at the same time, if you take them seriously, we have difficult costs, in the sense that we could have problems with the agriculture, and eventually, I promise to be very frank, eventually we could have some problems with the United States. That means all the contrary to what was the situation in the 90s, in which we could have the problem of the American firms with preferential treatment in the Brazilian market. But now, if we rush to have this agreement, we could have some serious problem with Americans that we say, wait a second. You will have preferential treatment for government procurement, capital goods, intellectual property, services in Brazil and in other countries, not extended to us. So I think that all this incline people to try to say, well, don't rush, don't move. There is an additional factor, I only mention it. I don't have concrete information about this, but sometimes I began to think curious ideas. And I began to think, well, wait a second, in this Mercosur, what are we talking about? Please explain me which is the relation of Venezuela with Mercosur. The question could be, is Venezuela a member of Mercosur? There are many elements to say, yes, it's a member. But it's not formal, no, it's not member, because the protocol has not been ratified. And then you begin to think, well, perhaps that country, that other country, perhaps, say, I don't know, Spain, could say, and I will get the trouble to go to my parliament to say that I have a special agreement with Mercosur, with Venezuela within, don't I have a risk that some people will get angry because not everyone loves the Venezuela government. So this could be also complicated. To finalize, possible scenarios and my final position. Possible scenario with respect to the future of the relationship between Mercosur and the European Union. The first one will be with respect to the negotiations between Mercosur and the European Union. It will be in a scenario, the happy end, that finally next year, in some moment, we finalize Doha, and as a consequence, we finalize Mercosur free trade agreement with the European Union, we convince the Americans, we convince the parliaments, etc. Happy end. And we have what was thought in the 90s that should be the relationship between these two areas. I said already that I have some difficulty imagining this scenario, but it's definitely the possible scenario because it's the formal scenario. The official scenario is this one. The second scenario is quite possible. There have been noises in the 3 last days in this direction. That is what I would call it a kind of Andean community scenario. That means bilateral agreements within a so-called common framework. But that will imply, finally, free trade agreement, Article 24, with only 2 countries and in an individual way. There have been some noises for different reasons, something that goes back to some years ago. Individual countries or sectors within individual countries in Mercosur have raised the point why we cannot have a bilateral agreement with the United States or bilateral agreement with the European Union. Sometimes this was part of the game with, for example, Brazil, to threaten. You push enough, I will have a bilateral agreement. And with the United States, there was at least one minister in Argentina that several times played with this idea. But then you find the same idea in the people of the Federation of Industry of Sao Paulo, or in governor of Sao Paulo, the actual governor of Sao Paulo, that is a man that could be president of Brazil in 2 years. Someone that you must take seriously. Governor José Serra, he has said openly, frankly, forget the Mercosur, we must go to a bilateral agreement with the United States. And also this has been raised by the government of Uruguay, and or at least one minister in the government, and now by one of the main candidates on the elections in Uruguay, former President Lacalle, that says openly, we need to have independence, to have free trade agreement with other people. When Uruguay began to say this, and when Argentina played with this idea, the Brazilians were very angry. One said, forget it. If you do so, finish Mercosur. That means finish your preferences in the Brazilian market. But there are some indications that things are highly dynamic also in this field. The first one is the strategic partnership between Brazil and the European Union. When I speak of the third scenario, I will mention this. And more clear indication that something is moving in that direction is the fact that Kirk, the U.S. Trade Representative, 3 days ago, concretely on Wednesday, his visit in Sao Paulo, in his interview in Valor Económico from Sao Paulo, raised the point of a bilateral agreement between the United States and Brazil. He made it clear that it's not a preferential agreement, and the reaction, well, was weekend. I didn't saw any reaction of the government, but the idea is there that eventually we could have again the triangle with non-preferential agreement of Brazil with Europe, non-preferential agreement with the United States, and people playing with the idea of going directly to a preferential agreement. I don't think that in this scenario we could observe for the time being, let's say the next period before Madrid, anything related with the idea of a preferential agreement, preferential in the sense of GATT, agreement between the European Union and individual countries of Mercosur, particularly Brazil, and eventually not even with United States, and that for a concrete reason, and this is necessary to have in mind because it's very important to understand things from the European side, that it was done and given by in several opportunities in his own way by President Lula, but more concretely by Chancellor Amorim. And I was there, I listened to him, in Davos two years ago, when asked by one of his colleagues, Minister of Commerce, why Brazil was yet with the idea of Mercosur, and Amorim answered very, very clear. For us, Mercosur is the equivalent of peace and stability in South America. That means this is a political project, and we are not going to leave aside this political project because we have problems also in South America. And finally, this takes me to the last scenario. It's a scenario that I would recommend strongly. And that is in a scenario in which we use what we have. We have an agreement signed, the Madrid Agreement, signed in 1995, with an agenda, with a concrete agenda. If you read the agenda of the Madrid Agreement, you compare it with the agenda of the strategic partnership with Brazil, no difference. These are the main issues. All the elements are non-preferential elements. This an agreement to work together in those issues in which we have common interests, with the advantage that if it is a non-preferential agreement, even within the Mercosur rules, you could play with the idea of variable geometry actions, in which not all countries could be eventually, if they are not interested, included. This will mean to put a great accent in the relation between Europe and the South American geographic space, particularly through the relationship with Mercosur, not saying nothing with respect to the preferential element, in the sense that everything is an agreement, we must wait for Doha. And if Doha fails, we must work together to find a way to do it in a different way. But that would imply that we send a message, concrete message, that the original, or one of the original objectives of both sides is still there. That is, we are interested in a multilateral efficient system, global system. We are interested in promotion of integration in the regions. That means peace and stability. And adapting this methodology to the realities. We cannot go in this direction. We are not going to say that we fail, because that's stupid if we can do it in another way. And we are not sending the message of bilateral actions that could be perceived as a way of not understanding that the essential of the South American problem today, from the point of view of regional governance of the geographic space called South America is similar to what was and is the essence of the problem in the European geographic space, that is to develop a pattern of institutionalized multilateral collective leadership to solve the different problems. There is no one single country in our region, as there is no one single country in Europe that could solve per se the problems. And that was the most intelligent idea and contribution of the Americans in the 50s to Europe. Jean Monnet found the way to do it, how to work together. Mm-hmm. But the idea, you should work together because we need you to work together, and that should be the message of Europe to our region. Well, that were my commentaries.
Thank you very much.